This is Don at Airbrush Technique Magazine, airbrushmag.com. Over the last 6 or 7 years of running the airbrush support forum at Airbrush Technique, the magazine support forum, some of the most common questions we hear is, how do I take my airbrush apart? Most commonly is, how do I get it back together after I clean it? So I put this little video together on the Iwata HP-CS. I'm going to walk you through taking it apart and putting it back together. To take it apart, we'll start with the back handle. Remove that. You want to put all these parts in a bowl so they don't roll away and you don't lose them. Don't do this over the sink so that something falls down the drain. Remove the needle carefully. Remove the spring guide. And then the needle chuck guide and the spring will come out. Remove the trigger. Remove the protective cap for the tip and the air cap. They both come off separately. We'll take them off as one. I want to provide you with a wrench to get this part off, which will expose the tip. And there you have the fluid tip. After you've cleaned it all, put your tip back in. It just sits in there. Make sure the rubber gasket is in place. Put your air cap back on. Make sure you don't cross thread it. Install the tip guard, both parts. Again, making sure you don't cross thread them. Next, we're going to install the trigger, and this can be a little tricky. You can see there's a slot in the trigger. That has to run the length of the airbrush so that the needle can go through it. And this little post fits down in the air valve housing. Once the trigger is installed properly, if you push down on the trigger, it'll spring back up. You need to get that little post lined up with the air valve housing inside the airbrush. It can be a little tricky and frustrating, but it can be done pretty easily. Next, we'll put the chucking nut guide back in. This little post on top needs to go up behind the trigger. So if you put it in at an angle, you can see that little post come up behind the trigger. Put your spring guide housing back on. Screw it in carefully. Don't cross thread it. Now before we put the needle back in, we're going to use a little super lube on it. Just a tiny bit. The whole length of the needle. Insert the needle. Push it in until it hits the tip. Don't force it in there. You'll feel it when it hits the tip. Just gently put the needle chucking nut back on. Put your handle back on. Make sure this little seal is in the back of the handle. Again, don't cross thread it. Now when you pull back on the trigger, you should see the needle going in and out in the front. When you push down on the trigger, it should spring back up. If you've cleaned it properly and you've just assembled it the way I showed you, you should have no problem. The airbrush should work fine once you hook it up to your compressor. This is Don at Airbrush Technique Magazine, airbrushmag.com, the best airbrush magazine published. For further airbrush support or questions, please visit our airbrush support forum at airbrushmag.com. airbrushmag.com. Thank you.